giving you the insider takes and the big picture view on the Dogs. This is On the Beat, presented by Ingles, with DawgNation insider Mike Griffith and Cody Chaffins.
Hey there, and welcome into On the Beat. Happy Monday night to you, Cody Chaffins and Mike Griffith. And Mike, the show is called On the Beat. And boy, between basketball, spring football, we are cooking on this beat right now.
Well, it's an exciting time for Georgia, Cody. I mean, as you said, so many things going on, and those are just the frontline sports, right? You've got a number one ranked tennis team at Georgia with the number one singles player, and all those other sports doing so well, track getting ready to get rolling. Josh Brooks really seems to have it going here at Georgia right now.
All right, we're going to hit a lot of that stuff coming up on this show. We will do a whole long segment talking March Madness, where we want the Dogs to land when it comes to the bracket, where's going to work out best. We'll hit that. We'll do some fearless predictions, talking about some of these spring sports as well, and even spring football. But we are going to start with spring football because Kirby Smart's scheduled to have his first press conference of the spring coming up on Tuesday in Athens. And as that happens, we will all start to get a barrage of news, right? And there will be tons of stories written about Georgia because we are on the beat, but there are apparently a lot of folks on this Georgia football beat. So there's going to be a lot of stories out there. There's going to be a lot of storylines this spring. And I kind of wanted to set up this show because as we start to get flooded with all of this, let's talk about what's going to be underrated and what's going to be overrated when it comes to storylines in the spring. And I'm going to kind of go one by one and get your thoughts. I'll share some of my thoughts as well. And we're more kind of big picture talk. When we we'll start with injury news. There's going to be a lot of injury news that Kirby's going to give tomorrow. Do you find spring football practice injury news underrated, overrated?
Most of the time overrated because most all the players will be back for this fall semester. Now, that's not to say that the spring semester is not important and the spring drills aren't important, but usually they have a pretty good plan for each player right after the season in terms of who's going to need surgery. They know the recovery window, and then they maximize those repetitions that are going to be available. If it's typically a starter, that's going to give somebody else an opportunity to get some valuable reps and build Georgia depth. If it's a backup, then maybe you don't miss it as much in the spring because this isn't a player expected to play a key role. But Georgia does a really good job, I feel like, managing their injuries in terms of getting guys back at key times and key moments. They're obviously quick to diagnose, and they have an elite medical team. So I tend to think it's a little bit overrated because the urgency isn't the same as perhaps if it was a fall injury or a fall camp injury.
I'm right there with you in the injury front because you look at last spring, Ty Ingram Dawkins missed the whole spring, had the best season of his Georgia career. Jalen Walker has missed a spring practice. Malachi Starks missed spring practice last year. I don't think we saw a huge fall off. And then kind of on the flip side of injuries, last year and the spring before, all we could talk about were the Robinsons, Rod Robinson and Branson Robinson having great springs. So it's not really a predictor of anything that is to come.
No, because there will be more contact in the fall now. Maybe not as much as the spring because Kirby's certainly aware of the scholarship numbers. And, this year with a lot of the guys moving on, 14 guys at the combine, they don't have as much maybe experience on the front line. So he may alter fall practices a little bit more to avoid contact and avoid the potential for injury. But I do think in the spring he turns them loose a little bit more.
Yeah, so we will hear that Monroe Freeling will miss the spring. I think that affects in no way what it means for him as a ceiling as a player or what he could be for this team this fall. All right, we'll move on. So the next one we have is the talk about freshmen. And I'll kind of, leading off because we're going to, as the media members, we're going to ask about the freshmen we want to talk about, right? And the freshman talk, I feel like sometimes can get way overrated, but there's going to be freshmen who come in who are going to make some noise. So I'm interested, when people start talking about freshmen, is all that talk overrated or underrated?
Most of it overrated, but I think this year with Elijah Griffin and Isaiah Gibson, you have two really key players that could make an immediate impact at some need positions, right? And we've heard good things from Warren Brinson about Griffin, obviously a very high-profile signee. So I think that talk is very legit. But in some of the other positions, when you talk about offensive linemen, it typically takes a while for them to get their footing. Now, maybe the running back, we'll see. But I kind of feel like there's adequate depth there. I'm going to kind of change the question a little bit, Cody. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but the freshmen may be overrated with the exception of those two defenders, but the newcomers, the transfers, right? Am I stepping on the next question?
No. Bring it up. Yeah,
Okay.
because
The transfers, I think, are underrated because
Okay.
nobody
Love
comes
it.
here to sit. And there's a reason why these guys were signed, and it was to play right away and make an impact. So when I look at those two transfer receivers and some transfer defensive backs, I think it's very important. So I'm going to jump ahead. I'll ask the question and answer it. Freshman talk mostly overrated. Transfer talk mostly underrated.
Yeah, I think last year I was very curious about all of this, just going back on the story. So I went back and watched Kirby Smart's press conferences from last spring practice and the 2023 spring practice to kind of see what I could dig out of there and what were we talking about. And so I was really curious to go back to last year and say, what were we saying about KJ Bolden in this moment a year ago? Was Kirby Smart talking a lot about, and Kirby wasn't talking a whole ton about KJ Bolden last year throughout the spring, even after the G-Day game. The one thing, the quote was, I think he'll help out on special teams this year. So that, he was kind of flying under the radar there. Now, I will say, Connor Riley in his, they opened out one practice to the media. He kind of put in there, everybody was hating on KJ Bolden's size. He looks just the right size to play. So we at least had some nice moments there. But yeah, so I think looking back to last year and the year before, it's hard to tell about freshmen. A lot of times we are asking the questions to Kirby and he'll answer those questions. But to me, it kind of takes me to my next point. At a Kirby Smart press conferences, it's those nuggets that he'll throw in there. To me, and you can tell me if those nuggets can be underrated. Sometimes he will throw in a name that you didn't ask about. So 2 years ago, they started talking about a tackle battle between Ernest Green and Austin Blaskey. And they asked the question about Blaskey. Kirby threw Ernest Green's name in that answer. A lot of times for me, that's the underrated thing about Kirby Smart's press conferences. When he brings up somebody you didn't ask about, better listen.
Yeah, I think Kirby does a great job. And I say that all the time. If you'll just listen to what the head coach says and listen to what he doesn't say. I think Kirby's very upfront about his program. Not only does he want the fans to know what's going on, but I think there's some messaging to the players and the team through the press conference. I don't think Kirby would say anything to the media that he wouldn't say in front of the team. I do think he is very careful to control the narrative. I remember it seemed like everybody wanted to get ahead of themselves with Ellis Robinson last year, and that was a guy who was not big enough, and that was what kept him off the field. I think last year was he lacked the physicality. It'll be very interesting to see the kind of year he had in the weight room and how much he's bulked up because we know those covered skills are elite. I was going to throw this in there with KJ Bolden. If you'll remember the role he played against Clemson, it was key. And perhaps Kirby didn't want to let on just how much impact KJ could make because he picked things up quickly. And he was actually, if you remember, a pretty integral part of that game plan. I don't think I'm ever going to forget that open field hit he had on Phil Mufa, the Clemson senior running back. That was kind of an arrival moment, talking to Smile Munden at Senior Bowl. He's like, oh, yeah, when that film came on, that was a big moment for KJ Bolden. So, Kirby may have downplayed Bolden a little bit, maybe didn't want to let his head get too big. On the other hand, he did kind of say, Ellis had some things to do. I think he recognized also that, Ellis was going to have to get a little bit bigger and more physical to stand up to the rigors of SEC football.
Yeah, it's really interesting to go back and listen to these press conferences because people will ask Kirby Smart, what they want to write this story. Like we all get this way. We get infatuated. Jeff Sintel's told us so much about this kid. We love him. We want to write about him early. And they ask Kirby about it and he'll straight up tell you he's not ready. And he knows he's not ready. And when you go back and look at those, yeah, he was right on all of the, he's not going to tell you a guy's not ready if he's really not ready. And I do think, we like to think, Kirby gets built up as he likes to hide so much. He really, hindsight, of course, is 20/20 on all of this. But he's telling you the truth in all of these press conferences. And then I'll tell you one that really stuck out to me going back and watched last year. They were asking about Carson Beck's spring. And he said, you know what? He's got to learn to trust his receivers. And that was something that kind of played out throughout the year. And they asked him, where's the chemistry? He says, this is spring practice still, but he says the chemistry's not where it needed to be. And I don't know that it ever truly got there and that he ever really, we heard from other people that he wasn't, throughout the season, he wasn't maybe trusting the tight ends or whoever enough throughout the season. But boy, that sticks out now. And as it all happens in their 30-minute press conferences, it's hard to pick that out. But when you look back, hindsight's 20/20 on some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I remember him saying was that he wanted Carson to work more with the younger receivers. He felt like Carson had a good enough chemistry with guys coming back, but really needed to work more with the younger and incoming receivers. And lo and behold, there were two suspensions to two key guys, and a lot of those younger receivers were pressed into action. I'm not going to say that it cost Georgia any football games, but that Alabama game was pretty close, and you wonder maybe if there was another 5 or 6 off-season workouts, if maybe Carson would have been a little bit more on the same page with some receivers, and maybe that first half doesn't get quite as out of hand.
Yeah, he did say, too, listening, he was worried about wide receiver depth, and we didn't know why they would need that depth at the time when Ra Thomas and Colby Young were still on the team, but they ended up being pressed into, the depth needed to be there. Talking about Carson Beck, going back to 2023, last time we had a quarterback battle, although even that one we felt like Carson Beck was the lead horse the whole time. So one of the articles that's going to be written this week, and I don't know if it'll be on DawgNation, but it'll be other places, about a quarterback battle. Ryan Puglisi, how will he push Gunnar Stockton? And are these two, or nobody's named the starter at this point? Do you think that'll be an overrated kind of storyline this spring or an underrated storyline?
Well, that's kind of a trick question there. The quarterback battle is certainly can't be stated enough.
Okay.
But is the quarterback of the future on the team right now, Cody? And it's not like that's something Kirby can talk about. If we were to ask him and say, well, how's it look for the battle for number one? He's not going to say, well, it's not going to matter because I'm going to try to sign another quarterback anyway. No, he's going to talk about the guys that are here. And I'm not saying that he is, because it'll be conditional, right? I mean, could there be 2 or 3 quarterbacks that Georgia would be willing to sign and bring in as free agents, veteran guys? Maybe. But if they can't get those 2 or 3 guys, then obviously the quarterback battle is much more relevant. Okay. And then part 2 of that is sometimes if all things are equal, and I don't think they are, I think Gunnar has a very distinct upper hand on Puglisi because of the experience. But let's just say they say, you know what? This is going to be more of a passing team. It kind of reminds me of the Stetson Bennett JT Daniels, right? Stetson was the guy with the mobility when you played double tight end and you were going to run the ball with a higher run pass ratio. Stetson fit that offensive personnel. You remember there's some injuries to receivers that year, and Georgia wasn't the throwing team that maybe we thought they would be earlier in the year when it felt like Arch Manning was going to commit. He was going to come to a school that threw the ball a lot. He watched JT light up South Carolina. He loved it. And then a few games later, Stetson's in there throwing 11 passes against Arkansas, probably not as attractive to Arch Manning or any other gunslinging quarterback, albeit Stetson represented himself well, and mobile quarterback said, oh, yeah, that looks good to me. But I think overarching, I'm going to say it's overrated because I think there's so much left to play out and so many possibilities, and it's so fluid.
Very interesting there. And yeah, you talk about Gunnar Stockton, and one of the things in the 2023, Kirby kept including him in that quarterback battle. They kept getting Brock Vandergrift, Carson Beck, who's he going to be? He's like, no, don't worry about. We got Gunnar Stockton needs to be a part of that conversation as well. So interesting to me, he's really been talked up by Kirby. Kirby's have confidence in him for a couple of years now. So
say this, Cody. As it turned out, Gunnar Stockton was part of the conversation, right? I mean, it was Gunnar's, Vandergrift transfers. Kirby probably had an idea that was a possibility, and therefore Gunnar had to be ready in light of the event of a Carson Beck injury soon after. I mean, if Gunnar hadn't gone to school on the game film, on the playbook, and I remember Jake Fromm telling Brandon Adams on DawgNation Daily about what a lab rat Gunnar was and how he was always in the film room. That's why Gunnar was ready to answer the bell in the SEC title game. Now, flashback just a couple of years ago, Carson Beck wasn't ready for his opportunity against UAB, and Stetson Bennett got the start, and 5 touchdown passes later, we had the beginning of a Georgia legend.
All right, one of the other things, and you talked about the transfer, so let's get to the transfers, wide receiver-wise especially, because you look at last spring practice, all the buzz was about Colby Young and what he was doing. So, when you get, they'll have the coaching clinic sometime this spring, and those coaches will get to watch some practice, and there'll be things that leak out. So how much do you put into buzz that is not coming necessarily from the head coach? Is that underrated or overrated? And then, wide receiver-wise, we're going to be hyping up Noah Thomas and, Zachariah this whole spring. Is that you feel like we're going to overhype them, or do you think, what are your feelings on that so far?
Well, let's remember what Dom Lovett told us at the NFL Combine about how receivers impress Kirby Smart. It's not by being prima donnas. It's by being physical and blocking and showing that you're willing to compete in all elements of the game, potentially special teams as well. That said, I still to this day don't believe that the George Pickens one-handed catch in practice video was an accident. They say that Kirby's everywhere. They say that nothing happens without Kirby knowing it. I think to this day that the George Pickens one-handed practice catch was a controlled leak.
Conspiracy theory. I love it, Mike. I love it. So if there's good things, we will hear about the good things. So maybe underrated?
Underrated, for sure.
I love that. And you talked about, looking back, again, watching all these press conferences, he wouldn't say much about Colby Young last year other than he's had his ankle tweaked. But at the end of G-Day, and they asked him, hey, he scored a great touchdown. He said, no, I'm impressed with the way he's approached special teams. And you talked about exactly what Dom Lovett said, too. That's how those guys are going to earn their way in, is how they approach playing special teams as well. And speaking of G-Day, last one we'll end on because it will be the last thing of spring practice. G-Day stats. We're going to get to this spring game. We've talked all offseason long now about how important spring games are, and we don't want to see them go away, and all these other teams are doing away with them. So at the end of the day, G-Day stats, overrated, underrated?
Again, I'm going to put a qualifier on this. The stats are overrated. The snaps are not. Okay. It's very interesting to see who gets the work with what team and what position. The coaches can massage the stats. And many times the best players aren't going to have the best stats. They're not going to, Nate Frazier is not going to get 20 carries in the spring game. I mean, this is your bell cow. The last thing you want to do is watch him get injured in a spring game. So maybe he gets 4 to 6 carries tops, plays a little bit more, but you're not going to put him in the line of fire. You're going to try to give those carries to a younger player who doesn't have game experience, that you're trying to get as game ready as possible, without putting him in a difficult situation. So now those snaps and those line combinations, it's very important to see how the coaches use the players, because that gives you kind of an idea of what they're trying to get accomplished. Now, there's one more layer of this that I wonder about. With some of these other teams canceling spring games because they don't want their guys to, maybe be recruited or spotted, I'm not going to say that it's beneath Kirby Smart to maybe hide a couple of players that he doesn't want to trot out there that he feels good about.
Interesting. I like it. I like all these things. You're a level below today. You're below the surface, which I love, Mike, when we get this kind of stuff from you, because you've watched a whole heck of a lot of Southeastern Conference football, covered Kirby Smart for a long time. So when you say stuff like that, I can believe a lot more of that coming from you.
I always say this, Cody. There's a reason for everything Kirby Smart says and does. There's nothing. It's very hard to catch Kirby off guard. I think I've only managed to do that a couple of times. Once was when he kicked a late field goal against Auburn, and it certainly appeared that he was running the score up on Gus Malzahn. And he wouldn't admit that. He was trying to come up with some sort of math where they needed a field goal, and I kind of shot back at him, and I don't think he expected that or liked it very much. But I was like, yeah, just say it, Kirby. You're still mad that Gus said they beat the dog crap out of you. You were going to get all the points on Auburn you could. But most all the time, Kirby's already thought this through. I mean, the guy thinks like a CEO. He's brilliant. His IQ is through the roof. I mean, we know he's a good football coach, but he's an absolutely brilliant public speaker. And he anticipates most all the questions. I'm actually convinced that he reads some online copy that comes out right after the game, a lot of it on DawgNation, and has a grasp of what the narrative will be. I think there was a game where one commentator suggested that Georgia was completely outcoached. And maybe not so coincidentally, Kirby, one of the first things he said when he came in there was that his coaches did a great job, which was kind of an inordinate thing to say. But it's almost like he's going to control the narrative, and he's going to get the important messages out. And like you said, most often very accurately.
Really interesting. And finally, for me, G-Day stats overrated. Last year, you look at Michael Jackson had a bunch of catches in G-Day last year. Andrew Paul had a touchdown, and neither one of them are on the team. And that was the other thing. Listen to these old press conferences. How many of these players we were all asking about who are not in Athens anymore? It's kind of crazy with the transfers out of this program. But to kind of sum it all up, Mike thinks underrated storylines you need to be paying attention to. trust the buzz that you hear coming out of camp. There's buzz there for a reason. And also listen closely to those nuggets in a Kirby Smart press conferences. The guys he brings up, those are guys to pay attention to. And we will have all of that covered. If you don't have time to comb through Kirby Smart's press conference, which we will have up on our DawgNation YouTube channels, be sure to check out DawgNation.com. Mike Griffith's coverage right there, Connor Riley as well. We will have it all covered. We'll tell you what the important parts are and the stuff you really need to be paying attention to. When we come back, we're going to talk about Georgia basketball. No more March sadness. This is March Madness, baby, as the Dogs get ready for the big dance. We'll break it all down next. It's On the Beat, presented by Ingles.
It's the moment you dream of. The moment you work for, train for, run wind sprints when nobody's watching for. The moment when hours of gym time, court time, prep time, all culminate into this time. The moment when millions of bounces, blocks, and boards all add up to this, your moment. Ingles, we're with you every step of the way.
All right, we are back on the beat. Coming up a little later on the show, we're going to have our feelers predictions about some of this stuff. We'll put some stuff on the record a little bit, have some fun with it as well. But first, let's talk Georgia basketball. They finish off the regular season with a huge win against Vanderbilt at home, where they kind of ran away with it early in the second half. And now they head off to the Southeastern Conference Championship, or the tournament at least, up in Nashville. Got to take on Oklahoma tomorrow night, really late tip. As they get ready and you look at this bracket, obviously everybody's saying nothing left to prove for this Georgia team. So what do you want to see out of Georgia in the SEC tournament, Mike?
I think you want to see him play well, but I don't think the result is necessarily paramount. I think they've, as you said, I think the resume's in. I think they've clinched a spot. And, we were having a conversation with BJ Sweeney, one of our senior editors, and he pointed out, do you really want to be an 8 or a 9 seed and be set up to play a 1 seed in the next round? And would you maybe rather be a 10 seed? And I have no concept that Georgia would tank a game and lose. They won't. They're going to try to win. They're going to try to go as far as they can. They have a really good team. I mean, they have a team really capable of beating anybody. We saw how close they played Auburn this year. So I think I just want to see him play well and get through it healthy, Cody.
Yeah, sorry. Starting to play on Wednesday night out there in Nashville. And, you're going to end up with some time off anyway, no matter what, because the first round, we're assuming Georgia's not going to be in one of the first 4 games out in Dayton. We've kind of seen them off of those last 4 in. So you're going to have this layoff. I guess that's the question, right? How much rest is too much rest, and how much you don't want to, also be tired going in?
Well, I think that's fair, but I'll point this out. I thought that one of the key turnarounds for Georgia this year was their bye week. And Mike White put in a 1-3-1 defense and some more zone that Georgia hadn't been playing. Remember, this is still a relatively young team when you take a look at the landscape. So I think this layoff is very valuable for Georgia. I think Mike has shown us that with this particular team, they were very productive in their last bye week. I think that was part of their season turnaround from 3-6 the first half of the season to 5-4 the second half of the season. So I think this layoff is really good for Georgia. And I have no doubt that Mike will be very productive. And with this young team, I think it's going to be very valuable, perhaps more valuable to Georgia than most other teams that are headed to the tournament.
Really interesting. Well said there. So let's move on to the NCAA tournament. You talked about it, the seedings, right? And that's the big question. ESPN has Georgia as a 10. Their theoretical would be playing Louisville in Cleveland. And then CBS has them as a 9 playing UCLA and Wichita. They could be all over the place. Could be in Lexington, could be in Denver or Seattle. There's all these possibilities of places they could play or teams they could play. So I'll ask you then the big question. Would you rather be a 10 play a 7 or an 8 play or a 9 play an 8? And a lot of that does kind of depend on that second matchup if you do get the win.
Yeah, I like the 10-7 game better. Wouldn't even mind an 11. And the reason I say that is because when you look at teams that Georgia's beaten, Florida and St. John's, playing Auburn within a bucket, leading A&M at halftime, being right there with Missouri, it's not a stretch to say, Cody, that this Georgia team could beat any team that they run up against, but particularly out of the SEC. We know the SEC is historically good. We can look at the top 10 rankings and whatever it is, 5 or 6 teams in there. I like the idea of the 10 or 11 seed because I'm very confident that they can beat a 7 or a 6 seed in the first round. And then to your point, that gives them an easier second round matchups than the 9-8 game. So a 10 or 11 seed doesn't scare me. Obviously, they want to avoid being in the first 4 and playing the playing game. I don't think you have to worry about that. They have a very strong resume, a number 30 net ranking. That's the metric-driven ranking that the committee looks at. They've won 4 games in a row. At worst, they'll have won 4 out of their last 5. So they've got the momentum, the recency bias in their favor. They have the computer rank in their favor. All their players are healthy right now. Georgia's probably with the best resume of the teams that are looking at NCAA, well, at least 8 wins going into the SEC tournament. So should they lose to Oklahoma in the late game, I really don't think it makes much difference. If they win, I don't think that makes much difference either. Now, if they were to win a couple games and beat Kentucky also, that'd be grand. We could be looking at a different sort of scenario, but don't really think I hate to say this, it just sounds so bad. I don't think the results for the SEC tournament are relevant unless Georgia were to go on some Cinderella run and win it.
So, Mike, you kind of mentioned it there, but I'm curious, if Georgia gets into the second round, there's going to be SEC teams all through this bracket, right? We know that for sure. So would you prefer to see one of, an Auburn or a Tennessee or a Texas A&M, Alabama, one of these teams in the second round, or would you rather steer clear of SEC foes?
I want to stay as far clear of the SEC competition as I can because they have a familiarity with Georgia. And I think other teams outside the conference are going to have a hard time matching up. Remember, Georgia won on the road against Georgia Tech. They beat Notre Dame. They beat St. John's. They played Marquette, really well. Georgia has looked really good against non-conference SEC teams even before the season. And we've seen this team grow tremendously in season in the SEC. So I think you want to stay away from SEC teams as much as you can in the tournament because I think the SEC is the most dangerous conference.
What's realistic for this Georgia team? What's success in the NCAA tournament this year?
Well, so much of that has to do with the matchup. And just like football, you never know what's going to happen in a given game or a given circumstance. But all things being equal, I think there's Sweet 16 upside. And, I think one win is probably, fair to hope for. But to me, realistically, with where Georgia basketball was at, the fact that they had that incredibly difficult, they played more top 10 teams than anybody in the country, and they still managed to find their way into the NCAA tournament. Again, it's not official yet, but we know that's coming. To me, it's all icing on the cake. Anything that happens from here, if Georgia gets in the NCAA tournament, which we're very sure they will be, or pretty sure they will be, that's mission accomplished. Now, anything you do beyond that is, helping yourself out in recruiting and maybe making yourself a little bit more attractive and extending the time that you have Ace Newell. This is an NBA first-round guy, and we saw Anthony Ant-Man Edwards a few years ago, and when will the next first-round pick be playing for Georgia? So it's all icing on the cake, but I do believe this is a team that can make it to the Sweet 16, and if they did anything beyond that, it would be unbelievable, amazing. And who knows, because of the way the seedings, maybe there's an upset or two, and Mike White's been to the Elite Eight before. Who's to say this team couldn't become a Cinderella?
You talk about Mike White and his time at Florida. They never lost in the round of 64, which is a good thing. Maybe he's got some kind of secret sauce. When you talk about, they always talk about teams that are going to do well in the tournament. What does it take? A lot of folks will say defense is important to folks. And Georgia 4th in the SEC in conference play there in scoring defense, 11th in the country in blocks per game. Do you feel like this is a team that can play enough defense is that what's going to keep them in some of these kind of games?
Well, I'm going to put a qualifier on that. So Bruce Pearl told me earlier this year when I asked him for his first look at Georgia, he said they have incredible 2-point field goal percentage defense. And to your point, that is very big because these teams are all playing at different sites. They're not accustomed to these arenas. And a lot of these arenas some of them are hockey arenas where like Bridgestone, for example, where there's a little more depth behind the basket. And that can mess with 3-point shooting teams a little bit. I've seen really good shooting teams not fare well when they get into these multi-purpose hockey arenas. Now, that's just luck of the draw. We don't know where they're going to go. Conversely, how will Georgia shoot the ball? Georgia had some shooting woes earlier this year. They've addressed a lot of that. But I do think that 2-point defense that you alluded to, I would agree with you. I think that 2-point defense and rebounding is like line play in football, right? If you've got a good offensive defensive line, you're going to be pretty good. If you can guard the rim and not turn it over and help your turnover assist ratio, which Georgia has also gotten better with, I think you give yourself a really good chance to win games.
Yeah, you talked about the 3-point shooting, and it's not a team that they've lived by the three. So is that a good thing at this point? Because if the 3-point fails, you've gotten this far without really being a true just hit it from outside kind of team.
Well, again, the NCAA tournament is such a potpourri. I mean, you're talking about different officials that you haven't worked with. You're talking about different arenas. You're talking about different style of teams, right? Are you going to play a half-court team? Are you going to play a press three-quarter trap team? Are you going to play an up-tempo team? I think you need to be good all the way around, which I think Georgia is. And again, we talked about that week off and Mike putting in a 1-3-1 zone. And who knows what he'll do with the extra preparation time. I'm sure he will massage some other areas. I mean, that's one thing Georgia's been very good at. And one of the things Mike's done really well is every time there's been an issue, whether it was turnovers or 3-point shooting or free throw shooting or, variable defenses, Mike has really brought this team along and coached them up. Again, a younger team, whereas a lot of these other teams are older teams. You look at Auburn, you look at the age of these players. These are a lot of experienced guys. That hasn't been the case with Georgia. So I think really, I don't think there's one thing you put your finger on, because you don't know where you're going to play. You don't know what the officiating is going to be like, and you don't know what type of opponent you're going to be matched up with. So I think that being a balanced team and having played in the SEC, Georgia should be very prepared for most any kind of team. I think that Georgia's balance and the different sorts of defenses they can play and the different tempos they can play at, I think that really behooves them.
All right, we kind of started with the football overrated and underrated storyline. So I'm going to give you one here. You tell me if I'm reaching a little bit too much. My mind goes back to the Georgia team, the only Georgia team ever to make the Final Four, right? The year before, it made a long run in the NIT. So Georgia makes a good run in the NIT last year. Am I reaching to say that postseason experience can help this year?
It already has. It's what carried over. It's what gave Silas Demery Jr. and Blue Kane the confidence to stay in the starting lineup, to bring that work ethic for the new players to arrive in a culture that was on an upswing. I mean, they beat Wake Forest, Xavier, and Ohio State. And if you're not a basketball fan, Ohio State on the road, by the way, if you're not a basketball fan, you may not appreciate that. But when you're talking about Xavier and Wake Forest, you are talking about two really tough, steely basketball programs. I mean, there's not an easy game against Xavier and Wake Forest ever, anywhere, anytime. Those were really big wins for Georgia to beat those basketball schools in the NIT. You talk about going to a Big Ten team on the road in that arena in Columbus where they love basketball in the Big Ten. And don't forget, Ohio State had just lost to Georgia in football the year before. They wanted that Bulldog blood up there in Columbus, man. They didn't forget that Peach Bowl. That was a very, very hostile arena. And so I think that, to your point, that success in the NIT was the first step for this sort of season, for Silas Demery Jr. emerging as a leader, for Blue Kane, recognizing what he needed to do to become a better defender and be on the court more than just a microwave scorer, a streaky outside shooter. I mean, now Blue's game has gotten tremendously better, but playing those postseason games in those environments, typically you say, well, who cares about the NIT? Listen, again, it's Xavier and Wake Forest. They care about every basketball game anywhere, anytime. Those were intense games. Playing at Ohio State, that was a hostile arena against a quality Big Ten program. Those games were really big for the Georgia Bulldogs to have something to build on going into this season in terms of their culture and their young players getting some experience in some hostile environments in big-time games.
All right, in just a second, I'm going to ask you to tell me what's going to happen with Georgia basketball over the next 2 weeks. But before we do that, we want to thank the Finish Long Drink for being a part of the show today. The Finish Long Drink is a ready-to-drink cocktail pre-made for you, already in a can. They have multiple flavors for you. You can get the traditional blue can with the citrus kick, the gin cocktail with a citrus kick. They also have a peach and a cranberry flavor. There's even a pineapple Finish Long Drink floating out there. So as the weather starts to get warmer and you're headed out to the golf course, throw those in the cooler on the side of your golf cart. As you're heading out to the pool or you're spending more time outside, there's nothing like a cocktail that's already made for you. You're not fumbling with bottles and trying to figure out, concoctions and mixtures one-to-one. And no. Just pop a top, take a drink. It's the Finish Long Drink. So tasty, and they've got a little bit of something for everybody. So to find out where you can get Finish Long Drink, head to thelongdrink.com. You just put in your zip code. It'll say, hey, go down the road, take a right, take a left. You're going to this store, and you will find Finish Long Drink there for you. So we've talked about it a ton here on DawgNation. Let this be the spring that you officially try some Finish Long Drink. All right, Mike, time for some Fearless predictions. So you tell me what is going to happen with Georgia basketball first in the SEC tournament.
Well, I think they're going to beat Oklahoma again. They beat them earlier this year, and I know that, Oklahoma is, fighting for a way to get into the NCAA tournament. They're one of the bubble teams. They really need that game more than Georgia, but I like the way Georgia's playing. I think those guys want the taste of a win in the SEC tournament. So I like them to beat Oklahoma. I do not think they'll beat Kentucky, and I think that has as much to do with Kentucky culture and tradition. Cody, you've been to these things just like me. They used to call it Catlanta.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be Catsville. There's going to be Kentucky fans everywhere. And Kentucky is a very good player. They lost to Georgia earlier this season. I think Kentucky is going to be ready for the Dogs, and I think the Dogs having to play 2 games in a row, whereas Kentucky gets that bye, is enough for Kentucky to get that win. I do see Georgia holding up as a 10 seed. I think they beat a 7 seed in Denver. That's my fearless prediction.
Okay, yeah.
I think they get to the Sweet 16, I think if they get to the round of 32, if they play another SEC team that's seated above them, which would be the likely scenario, I don't think they would be able to get to the Sweet 16. If they get to the round of 32 and play a team outside of the SEC, I like the Dogs to make it to the Sweet 16.
All right, recapping Mike. He's going to beat Oklahoma, maybe fall to Kentucky in the SEC tournament, going to get a 10 seed in the tournament, win their first round game, and as long as they're not matched up with an SEC team, they're on to the Sweet 16. I think they may lose to Oklahoma in the first round of the SEC tournament, and I think that's okay, like you said. I think they do get a 10 seed in the big dance. I do think they can win against, one of these schools. The only thing that worries me about the draw is if you get, some of these teams like Gonzaga and Kansas aren't going to be like their normal rank way up there, but facing a Bill Self or a Mark Few in the NCAA tournament, that worries me. If those guys fall to like a 7 and we get matched up with them, that worries me a little bit. But I'll say Georgia could win one game in the NCAA tournament.
They got to win over Rick Pitino already this year. So I think Mike White is a really good coach. I know this, and again, I reference Bruce Pearl because I covered Bruce for a long time at Tennessee, and we've had him on our program. He's a friend of DawgNation. He's a great guy. And Bruce has told me, hey, Mike White runs really good stuff and plays really good. And Bruce would not say this if it wasn't true. Mike is a really good defensive coach. He's going to take your best stuff away. His on-the-ball defense is outstanding, and he runs good stuff. And Bruce loves Asa Newell. I mean, Auburn would have loved to have had him, believe me. And he loves the 2-point field goal defense. I mean, they made life hell for Auburn in Georgia. And then Mike threw that 1-3-1. That was the game coming out of the break was Auburn. And they were within, a few points of Auburn in the final minutes at the Jungle down there. And Bruce said, man, that was such a great job, him getting that 1-3-1 defense. We weren't prepared for that. They hadn't done it all year. Just a great, great job. Bruce is a fan of basketball, and I think he's a fan of Mike White. So, and Bruce's opinion means a lot to me because, again, I covered him, and I know he's going to shoot me straight. So I'll take Coach Pearl's word for it, that Georgia's going to be really prepared. I don't think anybody's going to outcoach him. I think it's going to be a matter of how these guys play, and if they're playing at their best, I think you could see a Sweet 16 run.
One of my other fearless predictions is we'll get Charles Barkley talking Asa Newell. And how much fun is that going to be to have Georgia basketball on these national shows that we all watch this time of year talking Georgia basketball? That's it, right? That's why you wanted to get in the NCAA tournament, because then you're in those conversations and every basketball person everywhere has their eyes on that.
Well, they changed the narrative, right? I mean, let's face it. Georgia's got a long history. They've got 2 SEC tournament championships and 1 regular season championship. They haven't been in the tournament in 10 years. They haven't won a game since 2002 in the tournament. I mean, they were ranked for the first time this year for the first time in 14 years. You got to knock down these walls, on the way to rebuilding and reestablishing a program. And, throw this one at you, Cody. You weren't expecting it. What's more impressive to you? Georgia making the NCAA basketball tournament for the first time in 10 years, or Kirby Smart winning the 3rd SEC championship?
Kirby Smart winning the SEC championship doesn't blow my mind as much as Georgia finally getting back to the NCAA tournament, because it's been some lean times. All right, so that's all our Georgia basketball fearless predictions. We'll do some Kirby Smart football predictions in a second. Let's start with the other spring sport that, there's a few of them at Georgia that are hopping right now, but there's one team on a 15-game winning streak we got to talk about. The Georgia baseball team has been really impressive now. They will start SEC play coming up this coming weekend as they take on Kentucky. So give me a fearless prediction, UGA baseball style.
Well, I like Georgia to take 2 out of 3 against Kentucky. Kentucky went to the World Series last year for the first time in their program history, and their coach got Coach of the Year. If it wasn't for that, it would have been the Wizard, Wes Johnson. And I didn't make up the name the Wizard. That's what his players call him. One of the players said, he says he doesn't have all the answers, but we think he does. And when you look at Wes and you consider the Josh Brooks hire here, there were a lot of established coaches that had won other places, but Josh Brooks saw something in Wes Johnson that made him say, you know what, he's never been a head coach, but he should have been. We're going to be the ones to hire him. And Wes is remarkable. And anybody that's gone to a game over there at Foley, they know. I mean, that's a great environment. You can see the $40 million in upgrades, some of it above ground. They also have some new cages and, pitching lab equipment and locker rooms. This is an exciting team. I believe there's 23 transfers in all from 18 different schools. They've got a legit closer. I mean, this Brian Curley kid, I saw a picture of him earlier in this montage we've been running. This guy's legit. They got this big guy from Miami of Ohio. Everybody in the baseball stadium's worried Kirby's going to come over and recruit him to play tight end. The Z guy, we just call him Z. His last name's hard to pronounce, but Z, 6'4", 245. He's jacking home runs out, just beasting the ball at first base. It remains to be seen how he does against SEC pitching, but so far, I mean, he's remarkable. There's transfers, stealing base. It's a different team. Last year, you think about it, so much was about Charlie Condon and the home runs and the power, and it was kind of a top-heavy lineup. Now this is a team with speed that's much deeper through the lineup. They're able to generate runs. The pitching staff is deeper. Wes has had one more year. He's been able to get a nice bumper crop of transfers. That's kind of where baseball's at, is you got to be transfer heavy, get a few freshmen and develop. But the big thing is these guys are confident. There's a lot of swagger over there. They believe they're going to Omaha. They're not apologizing. There's nobody saying, "Oh, don't get ahead of yourself. Don't say that." So many coaches, they're like, "No, this is where this team's going to Omaha. This team's going to the College World Series." Like, that's how they see themselves. That's how they prepare. That's how they carry themselves. And you said it, Cody. They're 18-1 with a 15-game winning streak. I'm not going to tell them any different. It's going to be up to somebody else to knock them off. And I don't think Kentucky can win that series. I think the Dogs are going to take 2 out of 3 this weekend.
Kentucky ranked 23. For the record, Georgia's school record for winning streak for baseball, 20 games. And I think it was the 1908 team had 20 wins in a row that they reeled off. So pretty impressive. They won the Southern Championship that year, went 20-2. You talk about Rylan Zoborowski, 5 home runs over the weekend. Last year he had 10 home runs at Miami of Ohio. He's got 10 already for Georgia. Robbie Burnett had 17 last year at UNC Asheville, another transfer. He's already got 9. So Charlie Condon's 37. Doesn't look – he had 13 pre-SEC. So I'm not going to go fearless prediction and go that hardcore on you, especially the way Charlie – I went back and looked at the numbers, and he wins the Triple Crown. It was just so impressive. So nobody's getting there, but some fearless predictions. Good stuff, Georgia baseball. All right, Georgia spring practice. You got a fearless prediction for me on Georgia spring practice?
Fearless prediction on Georgia spring practice. Well, that's a tough one. I think that we're going to see more competition on the offensive line than anybody's aware of. I think that Stacey Searles, I think the quote from Xavier Truss is, "This is a guy that lights a fire under our ass." That was the direct quote. I think Searles is under fire this offseason. I think the coaching staff recognizes this is a major reload, Cody. You had 14 guys at the NFL Combine, and that's not counting Dirty Dan Jackson and Chaz Chambliss and Ben Urosic. So you're replacing 17 NFL caliber players. This is the biggest reload since the national championship team had 15 guys drafted. Now, obviously, maybe not of the same ilk, although there are 30 first-round draft picks off this team. So major reload for Georgia. Very important that these transfers have very strong springs. But the offensive line, to me, is going to be cornerstone to the success of the program, regardless of what happens at quarterback, running back, wide receiver. We saw that last year. It wasn't a banner year. We heard the guys talk about that. Tate Ratliff said, "Hey, we had an off year." There were guys that were injured. They didn't have the same amount of, synchronization on the offensive line. I think Searles is really going to mix it up. I think you're going to see guys playing a lot of different positions, and you're going to see an all-out war because there is a lot of offensive linemen on this team. You'll probably see some of them transfer after the spring. It remains to be seen who's going to keep their jobs and get that number 2 spot, and who's going to hit the portal after spring drills.
Yeah, especially without Monroe Freeling. You're going to see Jah Jackson out there a lot more, Bo Hughley. Let's see some of these guys, grow up a little bit and see if they can fight for some playing time. My fearless prediction for spring practice, Kirby Smart at the end of G-Day will say, felt like we had a pretty strong spring. Because he said that every year. He says, I don't think I've ever said we didn't have a good spring. So that's a safe prediction to say. I also can't wait to see somebody's going to get replaced by a young guy. And that's going to happen. It's going to start to happen now, and we won't know about it maybe until the season opener against Marshall. But there's going to be a young guy push somebody out of the way, and that's what Kirby admits that I am recruiting your replacement every day, and so there's going to be great competition, and that should be something real fun. We got UGA Pro Day coming up on Wednesday as well. I don't know you necessarily need to give me a number on a time or anything, but any kind of Pro Day fearless predictions now that we're in this mode?
I wonder if Arian will run again. The Georgia track, so to speak, is not as fast as the combine, but I'm not sure if Arian will run again. I know he ran a 4.36, which is still awful good, like the 3rd fastest time by a Georgia receiver in history. But he's such a competitor, and we know that he may have a 4.2 in him. So I'll go ahead and predict that Arian runs again and gets it under 4.3.
What's our over-under on NFL head coaches who will be at Georgia? Will it be 3.5? Mike Tomlin always comes. There'll be a few more, so I'm wondering, we'll probably get, what would you say, 3.5 will be, or you think we'll get more than 3.5 or less than 3.5 head coaches with 3 potential, I guess, Jalen Walker not working out, so 2 potential first-rounders?
Well, Bill Belichick's coaching North Carolina, so we know he won't be there. At least he shouldn't be there. Who knows? Maybe he will pop over, but and he's not an NFL head coach anymore. I think 3 is a good number, and that's pretty much the standard, but I do think you'll see all 32 teams represented once again. Might see a GM or 2. And it's not just about, this year. I mean, they come to visit with Kirby and ask about other players. And, there's some guys that may not be in the NFL draft next year, but maybe KJ Bolden's a first rounder the following year. Or maybe Nate Frazier's a guy they got their eye on. So I still think you're going to have the 32 NFL teams represented, but I think you're spot on there. I think that number 3 head coaches, and I think there's going to be a GM there too. Not sure which one. Just got a feeling somebody's going to want to check them out.
I'm going to tell you, the Atlanta Falcons need to scooch on over, especially today. Their free agent center got signed by the Bears, so they got an opening at center. Connor Riley brought it up on DawgNation at Large last week. Could they do the dog double where they get Mykel Williams in the first and Jared Wilson in the second? I don't know. I think Raheem Morris at least needs to be there, if not Terry Fontenot from the Falcons, because those guys are right in their wheelhouse, right where they need to be picking.
Well, there's no question. You could do a lot worse. I mean, there's still a lot of teams looking back at that draft with Jalen Carter going, what were we thinking? And I'm like, yeah, what were you thinking? Howie Roseman had it right. And it was a good spot for Jalen. But there is something to be said. And, our good friend Jim Nagy, who's no longer the Senior Bowl executive director, now the general manager for Oklahoma Sooner football, but Jim said, when you get a Georgia guy, you've got a guy that's going to compete, that's going to be able to handle the NFL practices, because Georgia's very similar, and they're going to be physical. And those are really key attributes. And they're also going to be able to play special teams. And, you get down to that second, third string guy, and you're trying to make that 52-man roster. You want a guy that's not only going to play special teams, but know how to play special teams. And, we saw Dom Lovett and Arian Smith as the gunners last year. I mean, those are tools in their tool belt that teams are going to consider. You start getting to that 4th, 5th round, and you start getting between 2 players. If one of them's a Georgia Bulldog, you're probably going to lean that way.
How about a guy who can run down and force a fumble? Dirty Dan gets his chance to work out in front of the scouts one more time. All right, Mike, what's the thing you're most excited about this week? If you had to go with spring practice as we wrap up the show here, it just had to pick one. Is there one that just sticks out?
Oh, man, for me, it's got to be Georgia basketball.
Yeah.
I mean, I just can't say enough about the job that Mike White did. And, when they were sitting there and had lost 9 out of 11 games, and a lot of people were writing them off, saying same old Georgia. And, I kept talking to those kids, and, they did not waver, whether it was Silas or whether it was Asa or whether it was Blue. They really held true to the company line, and they really bought into Mike White. I think this is one of the biggest years of Mike White's career. I mean, he did it at Louisiana Tech. He was effective. Obviously, he got Florida to the Elite Eight. but to come to Georgia and be the coach to put them back in the NCAA tournament and build a team with the right sort of connectedness and chemistry to be able to endure a 2-9 run in the toughest basketball conference in history. I think this says a lot about Mike White as a head coach, where he's at right now, and what might still be ahead as we look to the future of Georgia basketball.
Yeah, first time in On the Beat and DawgNation history that Georgia is going dancing in March. This time next week, we will know the Dogs draw. We'll have a lot more to break down then. But until then, for Mike Griffith, I am Cody Chaffins. See you next time right here on The Beat.